مساء الخير. مساء الخير. مساء الخير. That's a polite way of encouraging everybody to have a seat. مساء الخير. Then I would start to do that. So we at the Asfari Institute and the Arab Studies Institute are very thrilled to be introducing a panel organized by the Arab Council for Social Sciences, in which very critical challenges to academic engagement in social justice will be presented by three exemplary scholars under the leadership of Dr. Satni Shami. Thank you.
Thank you. We are also thrilled to be at this conference. There are many, many themes that this conference is addressing that we at the Arab Council for Social Sciences have been discussing in our own activities, in our meetings, our conferences, also with our Board of Trustees. So I want to take just 1 minute. I don't want to take too much time from the speakers, but just to briefly mention 4 areas that the Arab Council is working on. And I hope we can be in conversation with all of you as we move forward with these projects. And I hope we can be in partnership with the Asfari Institute on whatever they do moving forward on this set of themes. The first issue that we've been spending a lot of time at the Arab Council doing is mapping the state of higher education and specifically the state of social sciences in the Arab region. We have our first set of publications that has come out of this project, a report, a comprehensive report, a couple of background papers. They're available outside. Please pick up one if you're interested, and please contact us if you'd like to know more about this project, which is very ambitious but we think very important for our work and for the work of many institutions and universities in the region. The second set of issues that we are working on was really a topic of discussion in this past session. So I was listening very carefully, which has to do with studying the university as an institution, studying it as an organization, as a social actor in society, specifically looking at issues of governance and autonomy, at participation in the university, labor on campus, space, issues of space, and the university as space. And this is a project in collaboration with the Social Science Research Council in New York, and there will be a website called HERE, Higher Education in the Arab Region, in Arabic and English, that will be launched next month. So keep your eyes out for that. The third set of issues we're working on, and this is where we are in conversation with Perla, as well as Rami and Eileen and Mudar Assis, who was not able to come physically, which is around research ethics. Research ethics in a context of conflict. And research ethics not as a set of bureaucratic procedures that a university imposes on researchers, but rather as a culture of ethics that is part of an academic culture and a research culture in the region. So we're just starting work on this and hope to take it much further. It brings in all sorts of philosophical dimensions, epistemological dimensions, issues that Rabab actually just brought up in the last issue, as well as Jack Kabanji mentioned, are all issues that we need to think about. And last but not at all least is issues of academic freedom. Our Board of Trustees has been discussing what ACSS should be doing as an organization in the region concerning egregious violations of academic freedom of individuals, of institutions, and and this is not only sort of violations by states and of academic freedom and the rights of researchers and academics, but by social movements, by private sector, by all sorts of powerful forces in society. So it's a really complex set of issues. and that need to be addressed. So this is very telegraphic. I mean, 4 areas we're working on. Please do go to our website and look up some of these issues are discussed on the website. So the 3 people on the panel have been involved more or less in the work of the Council over the past years. I'm delighted to have them with me. The idea behind this panel has been addressed actually, and it's furthering discussions that have already taken place, and it has to do with social justice within the university, equity, equality, participation within the university, but also a major activity of the university is research. And so this is one way in which the university engages with society, a major way in which the university engages with society. And so issues of research ethics are very central, but at the same time, research ethics, usually the discussion of research ethics assumes a great many things. It assumes an autonomous individual researcher. It assumes a situation of stability. It assumes a situation where there are authorities that are legitimate and to which you are accountable. All of these conditions do not really obtain in most of our societies in the region. So I think these are some of the issues that are going to be discussed. And I'll go in the order listed in the program. So our first speaker, I'll introduce all 3 from the beginning, and each one has 15 minutes to speak. So our first speaker is Eileen Kuttab from Beirut University, well known to all of you, I'm sure, who will be speaking on gender equity and social justice in the university. Next speaker will be Rami Ali from the American University in Cairo, who will be speaking on academic freedom between the university and the state. And the third speaker, Perla Isa from the Institute for Palestine Studies here in Beirut, reflections on conducting research with Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And IPS will be having a conference soon on research in Palestinian camps, which we're all looking forward to. So, okay, this was high speed, very short, but I'm sure a lot of these issues will come up again. So, Eileen, please.
Thank you, Satine. I would first like to maybe thank Rafi, Futare, and Max for the very enriching and nourishing panel, which really have nourished our souls, to listen to the young academic activists who are struggling in foreign universities for Palestine, especially at this very critical stage of our life, where our children are being assassinated on a daily basis, and our Palestinian Authority, PA, is undermining our third intifada and oppressing the union movement of school teachers. We are really proud of all these struggles. It was very difficult to put a paper on all these different principles, but I couldn't start with gender, which should have been my role as a woman, without really taking into consideration, the political economy framework of universities, which I will start with because also one of the major challenges of Palestinian universities is the commodification of higher education. So, in general, of course, universities are known as sites of learning for critical citizenship, knowledge production, and academic scholarship. Recently, over the past 3 decades, which was mentioned before, but I have to put it in a framework, universities have taken a new model of governance and restructuring to accommodate the neoliberal market economy and to meet the needs of globalization, overlooking the need for further enhancing social justice and gender equality. Restructuring has touched the university's nature and scope of its mission, governance style, the nature and value of knowledge it produces, and its relation to the wider economy and society. This shift towards a global knowledge economy caused public universities to experience cuts in public funding, changing demographics of student bodies, advances in communication and technology as focus areas on account of social sciences, demands for increased accountability, efficiency, and cost effectiveness, while at the same time ignoring the negative impact of such policies on scope and boundaries of intellectual space, thus resulting in constraining freedom of expression, limiting the development of critical thinking, leaving the students and employees to bear the financial and moral consequences of on their own, disrupting the process of producing public intellectuals. Here, citizens lose their public voice as market liberties replace civic freedoms, and society increasingly depends on consumers to do the work of citizens. In the context of occupied Palestine, we are witnessing and experiencing some of the same global indicators and changes in local universities similar to other countries. What is really worrying is how these changes can become destructive in a situation like Palestine, where universities don't only play an academic role or a developmental one, but are tools for decolonization, resistance, and steadfastness against the Israeli settler colonial occupation, which enforces, of course, as you know, dispossession, exploitation, elimination of national and cultural identity. Indicators of commercialization of higher education in Palestinian universities are being witnessed in different universities in various degrees and responding to the discourse and neoliberal plans of the PA post-Oslo. To put this in a more concrete context, the World Bank has introduced structural adjustment policies as an entry point for transforming the Palestinian economy to a neoliberal market economy, imposing a post-conflict agenda. The most recent Educational Development Strategic Plan, covering the years 2014 until 2019, entitled Palestine 2020, A Learning Nation, articulates several broad objectives for Palestinian higher education and clearly indicate the confused identities. It starts with this, I quote, "Education is to prepare human beings who are proud of their religious values, nationality, country, and their Arab Islamic culture, who contributes to the development of the society, who actively seek knowledge and creativity, who interact positively with the requirements of scientific and technological development, who are capable of competing in science and technological development, and in applied fields, who are open to other cultures and regional and international markets, and a society based on equality between genders, build up higher education systems which is accessible, multiple, decentralized, diversified, flexible, effective." All these concepts were there. Efficient, sustainable, competitive, and qualitative. That's the end of the quotation. A discourse that really lacks internal harmony as it combines ethnocentric feelings in terms of national and religious identity, bearing traditional positions used for local consumption and political reasoning to neutralize traditional forces, while at the same time fill in selective modern principles reflecting neoliberal qualities addressed to the West and the donor community. Whether an educational system can produce the right organic intellectual in such a paradoxical binary is questionable. Furthermore, such a discourse within a colonial context can transform educational institutions to depoliticized, irrelevant, and alienating tools to the social and political reality. Looking at some examples of the restructuring paradigm in Palestine, I will be highlighting just very small examples with large consequences. One of the World Bank recommendations of higher education is the need to decrease expenditures by saving from educational budgets to deal with the government cutbacks by both increasing tuitions, number of students per class, and enhancing teaching productivity. Where is number 4? Sorry. Productivity, in my definition, is exploitation. The bank argues that since they have measured no substantive increase in academic performance when class sizes are reduced, hence maintaining large numbers is costly, irrational, and unnecessary. Most higher education institutions have taken this model in most undergraduate courses to ensure cost effectiveness and efficiency, neglecting by this the value of content, quality, potential for developing discussion space, and critical thinking, where students can engage on critical issues and have spaces for freedom of expressions. Another example is research. Most of the research is first quantified, donor-driven. Research is oriented only to policy formulation and not for academic and critical production. However, there are pockets in the university where academic production and alternative production is happening. And a colleague here who said about, or who used the concept counter-hegemony, I think some of these pockets are revisiting all these concepts to produce them in a context that is more relevant. Although, of course, we're not talking about universalism here, because fundamentalist and religious movements can use this entry point to really attack the women's studies in general. Another example of very important value, maybe to me in particular, was the social sciences in general and cultural studies programs in particular. In the different universities, there is a devaluation of cultural studies. And in particular, its value of theorizing the regulatory and emancipatory relationship among culture, power, and politics. A call for minimizing CS was done in Beirut also, 2 courses in CS, one only in other universities. In some universities, it was called Islamic culture, and another world civilization. And however, I want here to say that in the early 70s, when I was a student at Beirut University, cultural studies courses, the 4 of them, were required by all university students. And I remember the positive effect of these courses on our personalities, intellectual capacity, and political consciousness, as classrooms have been platforms for debates on important issues that touched our lives, realities, and taught us how to express our thoughts, create alternative analysis and solutions to our problems, and expand these debates. Issues addressed in these classes were material for public debates and continuous discussions in the cafeterias surrounding the old campus, where students and teachers sit together to reflect. And I think this is where the Palestinian revolutionary elite of Beirut learned hard politics, critique, and discourse of rights and freedoms. However, in the last few years, we have witnessed the gradual collapse of this program, which, in our view, is one of the conspiracies, maybe, of the neoliberal paradigms. The justification emphasized the financial and undermined the real causes, which the controversial nature of this program and its potential in creating critical intellectuals through initiating debates within the classroom that can become a reason for political conflict, which happened also in Beirut University, with a professor and a group of students supported by few faculty, as a result of posted caricatures on the professor's door, which were misinterpreted and threatened the freedom of expression because the professor had to leave. Another tool for commodification of higher education was the policy of increasing tuition, which expressed power on one hand, exerted by the administration and directed by the neoliberal paradigm, and injustice to the student movement and student body, which for the different stages of our revolution have been the structures for resistance. We usually celebrate the beginning of the academic year with either short or long strikes and sit-ins for tuition raise. One of the long strikes that I have witnessed closely is the long strike of Beirut University in 2011, when the student movement closed the university for 1 month. And I happened to be the president of the Union of Faculty and Employees. During this strike, I recall also my experience at AUB in 1974, in our long strike, which closed the university also for 34 days, and resulted in the expulsion of 103 students. I wished Mubarak was here to just tell him what happened. I realized then and now the organic link between privatization and oppression, and the responsibility of the student movement in understanding these issues without compartmentalizing them, which is a realistic and organic link. And also, these issues have promoted the different slogans, like the right to education for all, which was a uniting slogan for all different political parties and different political views. Okay, because we don't have too much time, I want to jump to the academia and women. And Huda, I think, introduced the issue. Of course, in regard to gender equality in the university, there are attempts made now to address inequality, female representation across disciplines and in the hierarchy. Of course, gender inequalities are currently prevailed, I mean, wherever, in all the globe, and in all universities, but in different degrees. But what we have realized, that a critical mass of women leaders committed to gender equality and transformative leadership and supported by women and men at all levels in the institution is needed to effect such changes. And in this context, I would say that the Institute of Women's Studies, which now celebrated the 22nd year, have conducted a gender audit in the university in 2015. And now we have the findings. And the gender audit, combined with different other also methodologies, social science methodologies, qualitative and quantitative, has drawn a gender map to locate where females are in the university. At the same time, we have done a gender review of the legal framework to see where the gaps are, and at the same time define the existing policies and strategies and their impact on the female participation and representation. The audit's objective was mainly to promote gender-specific policies that can enhance women's positions within the institution through defining appropriate and relevant gender tools and affirmative actions. Now, reasons for the gender bias, I might just highlight some of the findings, were absence, Okay, so absence of course, of gender-specific policies, but there was an informal patriarchal network was one of the problems that really have expanded the gender gap. At the same time, the neutrality of regulations, and this is very important. Neutrality of the regulations is discriminatory because it doesn't take into account the gender division of labor and women's responsibilities in the care economy. And that is very important. So in that context, we have only last week established the Gender Monitor. Now it's a body, autonomous body that reports to the president where gender-specific tools will be promoted and gender tools will be offered for, and by the way, the gender audit was conducted on all sectors of the university, not just the faculty, but also employees and students. And now the action plan is to try to remedy this gender gap with different policies. And there is an executive committee now that has been appointed by the president who will be doing this. As a conclusion, just one word. You may ask me, why are you doing this in Palestine in a national liberation struggle? It's not a priority. And I may say that to ensure a democratic state in 100 years from now, I don't know when, I mean, it's very important to start the process and be able to institutionalize the ethos of women within the institution, to be able to mainstream this model on other universities and in the region and in the local context. I'm sorry for the delay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eileen. Rani asked us to imagine the university we would want. I'm trying to imagine the conference we would want. I mean, obviously, we do the same in our conferences. You have 15 minutes, you have 20 minutes. I think we might want to think of different models of conference organizing, giving ourselves the space and time to really go in depth into issues. But, we do the same.
Yeah, I know.
So
we're in academia, we know that too.
Yeah. So we move to Rami Ali, AUC.
Hi, everyone. Okay. So seeing as time is of the essence, I'm just going to cut to the chase, which is that I want to subvert the title. The title says, academic freedom between the university and the state. And I find it very difficult to talk about academic freedom in isolation from anything else. I know everybody's kind of mentioned that in one way or another. But I can't bring myself to speak about academic freedom as if it should be or could be a privileged site, an immunized site where we can speak freely. And the interesting thing about living and working in Egypt right now is that that fact is so visceral. It's so there all the time. So I would like to start by just saying that academic freedom is, I'm stating the blindingly obvious, that academic freedom is absolutely related to the state of freedoms more broadly. And while academics may suffer in various ways, other people within the society suffer equally and perhaps even more. And the thing is, I suppose I could reel off all the terrible things that have happened in the last few months and in the last few years. I think it's no secret that since June or July 2013, depending on how your politics works, things have taken a dramatic turn for the worse. I can tell you about the number of people who have been arrested for speaking English and the number of people who have been arrested because in one way or another they see themselves as related to the January Revolution. I can tell you about the attempted closure of the Nadim Center. I can tell you about how academics at Cairo University can't move without the permission of the dean. I can tell you about how the AUC wants nothing to do with academics who are in trouble when they're doing research. There are a whole set of circumstances which really mirror very well the idea that people have already raised of lawfare and of the bureaucratization of academic life and life in general. And it's all done by the book. The interesting thing about Egypt at the moment is that Egypt, on the whole, is utterly unconstitutional. You know, we have a constitution which guarantees all kinds of rights. We have legislation which takes it away, you know, in a breath. So that kind of like, that bigger picture, I don't want to use the remainder of the 15 minutes to go into those kinds of details. I want to instead tell you how I've experienced it myself. Because the paper that I wrote for, well, you know, I have a paper which is called "Our Children Are a Threat," and it's essentially about counter-revolution, it's about publicness, and it's about cultural time. And the reason I got around to doing this paper was that I had tried to produce an ethnographic film in 2013, and it failed miserably. Some people may see the failure as being related to academic freedom, but for me it was because of the broader kind of constraining of the public sphere at that time. And essentially what happened was that although I'd set up the research quite well, I'd made contact with people and it was all going absolutely wonderfully. Just before I was going to the field, it was supposed to be in a village or a reasonably sized town in the south of Egypt. My interlocutors called me up and said, "Please don't come. Please don't come. We're worried about what your presence with us will mean, what kind of implications it will have, what kind of questions people will ask." And I remember at the time thinking back to a series of adverts that were put on Egyptian TV in 2012. So I'm going to read you the advert because I think it's emblematic of what's going on. So it's a series of public service announcements that were produced by the military's Morale Affairs Administration and aired on a number of Egyptian television channels in 2012. And in the first one, a young man enters a shisha cafe. His nationality appears to be unclear. He could be Egyptian, but for an Egyptian audience, his fair features code him as foreign. Voiceover. From the outset, he knows why he is here and he has identified his target. Right? He will find his way into your heart as if you have known him for a long time. He is able to obtain lots of sensitive information for free. The spy approaches a table where 3 young people sit, 2 females, 1 male. They are welcoming and friendly and invite the spy to join them. One of the females has a kufiya wrapped around her neck to identify her as an activist. And she says, "When I was on the metro, I heard them conspiring against the army." The other says, "We have a cooking gas crisis." The young man says, "We have a huge traffic problem and prices are sky high." The young male, the spy replies, "Really?" in English, right? In this kind of, with this expression of glee on his face. And then the voiceover comes back in and it says, "Who are you complaining to? And why expose the heart of the country to him? You can't confide in just anyone. And you don't know who he is and who is behind him." And the byline of this advert is, "Watch what you say, every word has a price, every word could save the nation." Suddenly, I was turned into this spy. I had become the spy, and so had literally thousands of other people. And this is why academic freedom, in a sense, is connected to the broader kind of way in which public culture can be orchestrated by a regime which controls, you know, to a large extent, what can be said and what cannot be said. You know, I'll give you what I concluded, because I think I have to go straight to conclusions, is that for the Egyptian state, research is a form of 4th-generation espionage. That's how they see research. I have a quote here from the current president, who says the following. He's talking to a group of, you know, the literati and intelligentsia, and he says the following: how can I stop my children, and of course he believes that, you know, everybody is his child, from being arrested? I'm prepared to accept that they express themselves, even if their opinions at that moment are mistaken. But I want them to be able to express themselves without taking the whole country to collapse with them. If we are to complete the picture, if somebody is targeting Egypt, how will they target Egypt? His answer is, using research and studies that have been taking place for many years. They have reached the very core of our society. They have entered into its nooks and crannies. They have identified its weaknesses and its strengths, and they have started to work on how to exploit the weak points and to sideline the strengths in that society. So essentially, and this is verbatim, so essentially, I mean, I don't see that academic freedom is in any way distinct from the broader problem of freedoms in Egypt. And what I see taking place over the last few years is a huge set of constraints on public culture, on what it is possible to say, and what the consequences are. So, as I told you before, as the Constitution guarantees the right of free speech and does not allow anybody to be imprisoned, for example, for publication crimes, people are still put in jail for those reasons. Now, the way that I kind of tried to make sense of all of this was not by looking at academics per se, but by looking at people working in arts and culture or in various other realms. I have two more quotes. They're all quotes from two people that I interviewed. One of them is called Mariam, and she's a performance arts activist, and she says the following: if we documented the shit we have to go through every day, it would make you stay in bed. But this is our reality, and we have to deal with it. I personally have no intention of closing today, or tomorrow, or to stop working. I believe that I'm doing the right thing. My only fear, really, is losing the language to be in the same space as others. This is in public. But legally, khalas. If they decide this time, this is November 2014, that they want to shut us down, there's nothing I can do. I'm going to cry now. If I'm doing everything that I can, if my paperwork is in order, and if they still want to stop me, fine. They will do that, but I will not do it myself. I will not stop myself from working. This is the conviction that makes us come to work every day, and you have to always ask yourself, am I doing my best? Yes, we are living in an absurd situation, but don't let what's happening to you on the inside stop you. Now, Mariam is not either a protest activist, she is not working, she's working on quite a benign area, she's working on performance arts in public. And for somebody to be, you know, experiencing that level of anxiety just because they produce a form of art, for example, that does not correspond to the state's notion of art, which is, of course, art which is nationalistic and art which is militaristic and so on, is quite disturbing. I have another one, Fatin. Fatin is a campaigner on alternative histories. And she says the following: we thought we were going to get raided all the time. There was this constant question of whether it's worth it. And she admits, and we're not even front line. Right? It's highly unlikely that it was going to happen, but we still needed to take precautions, to be prepared, to know the number of lawyers, to make sure that we were ready for it. What was constant during this period was insomnia, not being able to eat, being angry with your child. And her question is the unhappiness worth it? Is rotting in jail worth it? Fatin's ostensible crime, of course, was to produce forms of history that challenge state narratives about the preeminence and benevolence of the state's institutions in particular critical events in modern Egyptian history. These might be 2011, it might be 1919, it might be a whole series of things. She was looking at, you know, how popular histories can make sense of things. You know, people working in this third sector spent 2014 and 2015 either shutting up shop, stopping email communications, not being able to work because of this culture of fear. And of course this touches everybody, both, you know, within the third sector, within the culture sector, culture and arts, and within the academy. I mean, the way that I made sense of this, if I can just very quickly wrap up, is that I do think that there is a generational divide in Egypt. And lots of people who come to theorize, who think about generational theory as a form of orthodoxy, object to this idea. that we think about society in terms of generations. But the way that I've kind of tried to reconstruct this is to suggest that there are two political generations. The generation of 1967 as a political generation and not a biological generation, and the generation of 2011. And that those generations may include people from a broad spectrum of age groups, but that they define them through their politics and through their understanding of what constitutes freedom, what constitutes culture, and so on and so forth. And so what this made me think about was not just how the state has orchestrated a moral panic around these people. I mean, we have the return of things like al-muwatinin al-shurafa, you know, these honorable citizens who, you know, the snitches. You know, we are back in that place, but also that this 1967 generation, I'm sure lots of people are going to disagree with me about this, would be described by Muhammad Abd al-Jabri as the generation of as-sukun, right? Those who, and al-i'timad, those whose notion of the present is kind of formulated through dependence upon the past. You know, and all of the kind of, you know, the way in which neo-Nasserism has become like a leitmotif or a cultural narrative is very indicative of that. Of course, Sisi and Nasser are very different in many, many ways, but it's the way in which, you know, this warning now in Egypt. I mean, I mean, the best example I can give you for the academic freedoms issue is that in the very month that the president was inaugurated, one of his first interventions, people had been expecting since 2011 a new universities law. And what the president did was, instead of inaugurate a new universities law, was provide an amendment to the existing law whereby he had the power and the authority and the right to appoint deans and heads of universities. I mean, it's an absolutely amazing thing to do. And so, I mean, in summary, what we have now in Egypt is quite simply a control culture. That is, you know, and control culture is the way that they perceive both the present and the future. You know, it's very disturbing to think that it's the future that is being defined by the past. And what this control culture really fears more than anything else is what al-Jabri kind of describes as the motions of transcendence, right, in cultural time. You know, those that are about movement per se. So, I guess, have I run out of time? Yes, I have run out of time. So, I don't really have an answer as such, but what I would always try and say is that maybe we should completely stop talking about academic freedom, and we should just talk about freedoms per se. And we should, you know, people in Egypt in the last few weeks have been horrified, obviously, by what's happened to Giulio Regeni. And more action has taken place in the last few weeks than has taken place in the last 2 years. And that makes me really ask a question. While we acknowledge that academic freedoms are related to broader freedoms, it seems that we only act when our own freedoms are the ones, you know, where the guillotine is over our neck. So I would like, what I would offer is, why don't we just lose the academic freedom thing and just talk about freedoms per se? And maybe that's a more productive way in which we can connect up beyond the academy. And I think I'll leave it there.
Right, great question. Let's move to Perla Isa. And you're using, yeah. Yeah.
Hi, everyone.
Let me get my yellow card.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here. I realize I'm the last person on this panel and the last person to speak today. So I feel I'm kind of in between you and kind of the rest of your evening and the outside world. So I'll try to be kind of very brief. When I applied to this conference, I wanted to force myself to think through some of the dilemmas I felt while being a researcher, an academic researcher in a Palestinian camp in Lebanon, in Nahr al-Bared specifically. And I felt that this conference that kind of looks at the relationship between academia and social justice is the perfect place to kind of reflect upon the relationship between the academic researcher and the researched community, considering that a lot of our research is usually done in kind of underprivileged communities, and it's often motivated by desires to work towards social and political justice. And I just want to stress that I see my presentation more as a discussion, as a kind of a springboard for questions or ideas, and I would welcome kind of your thoughts and ideas or your experiences that would kind of help me work through some of the material I'll be presenting today. This is just a picture of Nahr al-Bared. I just think it's always kind of nice post-conflict. So I'm going to begin by recounting a little vignette, a little story from my time as an academic researcher in Nahr al-Bared that I think kind of illustrates well the point I'm trying to make today. But first, I'm just going to give a little bit of background information into my own relationship with Nahr al-Bared. I first met Palestinians from Nahr al-Bared in 2007 during the conflict that pitted Fath al-Islam to the Lebanese army. The conflict lasted about 3 months, destroyed the whole camp, and most of the residents were displaced. At the time, I was working on a documentary film, and I met many of the displaced families to kind of interview them for the film. And throughout the years, I kept up a relationship with them. And then when the film was completed, I screened it several times in Nahr al-Bared in many NGOs. So all this to say that I kind of kept up my relationship with them. And then in 2010, 2011, I started my PhD, and I became a researcher in the camp, and that kind of completely changed my relationship, and which is kind of the topic of my discussion today. So the story I wanted to tell you about basically happened at the beginning of my fieldwork. I was visiting the head of an NGO that I knew very well, kind of to talk about my topic and kind of get her feedback. And as I started talking to her, she interrupted me, and she's like, oh, wait, you know, there's a group of young kindergarten teachers meeting next door. Why don't you go and ask them your questions? And she kind of got up, took me with her. We went to this kind of small conference room. It seemed to me that the women were kind of finishing up their meeting, and she introduced me quickly as a researcher and left the room. The women around the table kind of all looked at me, you know, waiting for my questions. I didn't have questions. I was very embarrassed, actually. And then I was silent, so one of them kind of looks at me and tells me, you know, what do you want? Do you want to solve our problems? And she was obviously being very sarcastic. Thankfully for me, kind of a woman, another NGO worker kind of walked in and kind of, she had a task, so she kind of changed the dynamics, and so I was kind of saved by the bell. But the words of this young woman kind of stayed with me, and they had a strong effect, because by saying, you know, what do you want? You want to solve our problems. She was really highlighting the fact that a lot of researchers come to the camp and portray their research to be kind of working towards, like, having as a goal, like, improving the lives in the camps, having as a goal kind of to work towards kind of social, political, economic justice. When at the end of the day, the only life that is improved by the research is the life of the researcher, you know, him and herself. And this, in a nutshell, is the point I want to make today, which is that academic researchers in the Palestinian camps in Lebanon are at a risk of being considered, if they're not already considered, what I'm calling, for better or for worse, it's not the best expression, but misery profiteers. And when I come up with this expression, I kind of have inspiration from 2 places. One is the most obvious, which is called war profiteers, you know, people or organizations that profit from warfare. In this case, it's people or organizations that profit from other people's miseries. But the other source of inspiration is the refugees themselves and the terminology that they themselves use. So you would hear it's very common, and I will be showing next examples, it's very common to hear Palestinians say, في عالم عايشين على مآسينا. You know, people live off of our misery. في عالم بيستغلوا مآسينا. You know, there's people who exploit our suffering. And I just want to kind of characterize this concept of kind of misery profiteering as it's understood by the refugees themselves, before I kind of move on to examples. So it's kind of, just to break it down into four elements. One is that it's characterized by people coming to the camp, actively asking for cooperation and for the participation of refugees in a particular project or a particular enterprise. So 1, 2, while claiming that this kind of enterprise has as a goal the betterment of the life of the refugees, that the goal is economic, to work towards economic, social, political justice. 3, that the end result is that the only ones who actually profit from this thing is the entrepreneurs themselves, while 4, the refugees are left behind. And I just want to note that while this may apply to research in other communities, I'm kind of making the case today that there's a kind of particular Palestinian element that needs to be kind of acknowledged and explored, which is what I'll be doing. So what is this element? Basically, I would like to postulate that the way that Palestinian refugees experience or perceive researchers today is shaped by 2 past experiences that need to be kind of analyzed to properly understand kind of contemporary attitudes towards academic researchers. And these 2 experiences are, one is the Thawra, what's called the Palestinian Revolution of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and the subsequent betrayal and abandonment of the leadership, and 2, the experiences with NGOs since the 90s. So I'll begin with the first, the Thawra, and to see how refugees understand it, how they make sense of it, and how they talk about it. And here I'm going to quote from a discussion that I had with a man I'm going to name Abu Ali. He's in his mid-50s. At the time of the discussion I'm quoting from, I had known Abu Ali for about 4 years. He's a man of many trades. He's at one point had a thrift shop, and another point opened kind of a fresh juice and grilled corn on the cob stall. He's a welder, he's a fisherman. He's also a poet and a screenplay writer, and he's very active on Facebook and always posting his writings. And my research at the time, kind of my PhD research, was about kind of the daily interactions of factions with refugees. So my discussion with him centered around that, but what I'm quoting from is the beginning of a conversation, of a 2.5-hour conversation, and this is how he chose to start. So he says, people lost their trust in the factions, those who had as a slogan the liberation of Palestine. People sacrificed a lot and gave as much as they could and more. I remember how people used to give to the Thawra. I was a shibl. I was 12 years old. I remember in 1970-71, people were factionalized, but they did not get a salary. I remember how my father used to sometimes pay a membership fee. We had a small shop and we used to sell fruits, and he would pay to the Jabha, the PFLP. So at that time, I was a shibl and used to go to the bakeries. The bakeries in the camp were communal. You prepare the dough at home and you go to bake it. The women would be there waiting in line. I used to go get bread from them for the Thawra, for the bases, for the Fidaiyin. Sometimes a woman would give me her entire batch, 30 loaves of bread. We're talking of the Arabic bread, terghif. She wouldn't leave anything for her family. See how people were honest with our Thawra, but unfortunately our Thawra was not honest with the people. Unfortunately, the liberation of Palestine was an empty slogan, shi'ar wahmi. So I ask, why an empty slogan? He replies, this is what they make us feel, that it was all a lie, that they were not honest. Those who accept Oslo and 27% of the West Bank can't be the same people holding the slogan of armed struggle until the liberation of Palestine. It was a lie, unfortunately. We spent our life in the Thawra, and as they say, some build castles and some build graves. Abu Ali is clearly pointing to the fact that there were winners and losers, and it falls back into kind of the 4-point-based idea of kind of misery profiteering. Clearly, you have kind of a wholehearted and trustful engagement from the refugees towards the Thawra. People were honest, they were willing to give and sacrifice. Towards a movement that had as a goal the liberation of Palestine, but yet at the end of the day, some profited with castles and others were left behind and ended up with graves. And this expression, some build castles and some build graves, في عالم بنو قصور وعالم بنو قبور, is very common in the camps. And it's certainly not new information or kind of controversial to say that Palestinian refugees in Lebanon or Palestinian refugees anywhere consider the Oslo Accords to be kind of a betrayal to the leadership, who are seen to have been more interested in their kind of own survival than the Palestinian cause. But I think there is value to kind of juxtapose this experience with the subsequent experience of refugees with the NGOs and later with academic researchers. So similarly, the relationship between refugees and the NGOs can be understood to be following the same pattern. And we can look at several quotes. So the most common one, and this is something you hear over and over and over again in the camps, during the 2007 war, some people got richer and some got poorer. The factions and the NGOs made money off of our misery. They get funding because of our situation. They give 25%, and they take 75%. However, there's another, I mean, this is so common, but there's another example I think would be very revealing. And it's about an NGO project that was called Money for Work, المال مقابل العمل, which is surprising because usually you have money, for work. And it was executed through a partnership with a local Palestinian NGO, an international NGO, and a European funding agency. And the quote I'm going to show you basically is from a young woman named Lina who worked for 3 months on this project. And the discussion was in the presence of Abu Ziyad, who is an office clerk, and a colleague named Rania. So Lina says, there is funding coming. Honestly, I don't know what its goal was. Was this funding destined for a project, or was it funding that was intended to be distributed straight to the people, and they turned it into a project? I really don't know. What I know is that there was an idea. I am not sure if it was their idea or the funder's idea. But the idea was that instead of giving the person money and get him used to laziness, and to get him used to just receiving money, I will give him the money but in exchange for work, so that he feels that he received the money because he exerted an effort, that he didn't take the aid as charity, that so that he gets used to working to get money, because obviously Palestinians are not used to working to get money. So Abu Ziyad interferes. I will tell you, this is funding coming for the people. We make the people work a bit and we put in our pockets a little. So Lina continues, now the issue of the pockets are open everywhere. Rania comes in. Well, I didn't dare say that, but turns out it is true. Wow. Abu Ziyad continues, no, I say it. What is this work? What did I gain from this work? What do I gain from trees? Am I going to sit under the trees? They got pickles to give to people. I'm not going to continue just because I'm running out of time, but I think this kind of shows clearly how Palestinians kind of understood their own relationship with NGOs to be one of exploitation. And again, the idea of misery profiteering is quite clear, especially from Abu Ziyad's perspective. You know, here are NGOs kind of asking, almost coercing the participation of refugees in a program under the heading of kind of alleviating poverty while they enrich themselves and while refugees are left behind. So what I'm postulating today is that these experiences shape how Palestinians react to and perceive researchers today, who have actually increased in large numbers since the Oslo Accords. And many Palestinians talk about the ijtiyah al-bahithin, the invasion of researchers. And so just all this to say that academics, myself included, would fit under this category. And this was a tension that I felt throughout my work, my fieldwork in Nahr al-Barid. And while I would often tell myself that, you know, I'm doing this research with the hope kind of bettering our understanding of the dynamics of the community, I could certainly not ignore the fact that it was I who would gain from this and gonna get a PhD while the circumstances of the community would remain the same. And this is, I think, what the young woman meant to say in that NGO that day, that in her sarcasm, she was highlighting that kind of the true or false pretense that researchers carry with them when they kind of work under the banner of social or economic justice. So I just want to end by saying that some may venture to say that these issues I'm talking about today are not new, and they're actually quite widely discussed in many disciplines, including anthropology, oral history, or feminist studies. But I just want to point out that the actually discussion of ethics is missing from Palestinian refugee studies. And with the exception of actually one article that talks of over-research in Shatila camp, there's very little discussion of ethics within Palestinian refugee studies, which is surprising considering kind of the protracted nature of the Palestinian and Israeli conflict and the large amount of research that's been done about the topic. And I think that one possible explanation that can explain kind of this lack of a debate about ethics is that many of the researchers on Palestinian issues see themselves as activists, engaged in the cause. And that because of that, we think that it's kind of sufficient, and that we do not worry about how our research affects the community. While what I'm saying today, in actuality, kind of presenting our research under the banner of kind of social and political justice, kind of working towards that, may actually do harm to the community under study. So I'm just kind of ending to say that if kind of you're interested in this, as Sydney mentioned at IPS, we're doing a workshop in May about the ethics of researching the Palestinian camp. So if you're interested, let me know and give you more information. Thank you.
Thank you so much for everyone. How much time should we give for discussion? We're at when we were supposed to end, right? 5:30.
Well, I mean, I suggest at least 15 to 20 minutes, and then we can gauge the energy level and see if we want to extend it until 6 o'clock as a whole.
Okay. Okay, a list, right? Okay. All right. Rabab.
Yeah. Thank you for these very depressing presentations.
I realize it's the ACSS. We're depressing.
And so I'm the activist in me is trying to think how do we get out of the depression, but at the same time, you know, like I want to also stop and think about what we're talking about, and so I have actually quick questions for Eileen and for Rami, and I want to talk more with you, Perla, because I was one of the people, I have done research, but I've never published it. So this is sort of like another big issue, you know, about that. So, and I don't want to kind of like engage in personal therapy, but I want to kind of raise some issues about that. We can do that later. But for Eileen, so we have a gender monitor. I mean, so at the end of the day, so the Palestinian Authority goes and tells the whole world, now we have a gender monitor. They're doing, oh, this is the Birzeit. Okay. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit and talk about how is it that the gender monitor is monitoring different structural issues that the Palestinian Authority doesn't want to talk about, because they want to talk about some gender things, but they don't want to talk about everything that so maybe they don't want to talk about the families of prisoners, but they like to talk about how women go in Ramallah and sit in cafes or whatever, you know. So I'm just, if you can elaborate on that. Rami, so, I mean, this is kind of like, so Lenin's question, what is to be done? I mean, so what is to be done? What is to be done given the situation? This is the fact that it is like, there is not, and it seemed to me that I was at AUC in 2000, and Sa'aduddin Ibrahim, when I actually went and got hired, Sa'aduddin Ibrahim was just arrested. Sa'aduddin Ibrahim was one of the people who was part of the, you know, the ruling elite. He wasn't like a counter-revolution, he wasn't a revolutionary or anything, but the regime, the Mubarak regime was not willing to tolerate somebody talking about the elections. I'm not actually arguing that it's different. It's not different, but if you can, like, you know, elaborate on this. How different, how is it different, what's going on, what should we do? But for Perla, this is the big, I went and actually Satani, you remember, you made it possible for me to go, because I wanted to research, how do Palestinian, no, and I've been really thinking about it ever since, because I was part of the refugee studies program at AUC. I wanted to ask refugees, how do you feel about after the PA, the Oslo gave up on your rights? And then I thought I went to Shatila. And actually the first question I was asked, why are you here today? Because that was the day Sharon was elected. It was coincidental. It just so happened that they were doing a workshop at that time. But so I've met people, and I kept going back, and part of the reason is going back, I kept going back as a Palestinian activist, honestly. I kept going back because I felt very connected, and I wanted to go back. I took my students from Egypt, my students started a project, and so on. And so, but my question is not, and we can talk about all the details, but there is a question about the ethics of it, but structurally, I think the bigger issue is the structural context, because whether Palestinian researchers go or they don't go, the research is continuing. Historically, Julie Petit argued way back in her book that refugees think of the researchers as a microphone. that you want people to go and speak about the situation because this is how the world knows. And this links to the earlier panel about the whole question of doing solidarity with Palestine and so on. So if the world only knew, which assumes that if people know they're going to do the right thing also, but it also speaks to our topic about social justice and the production of knowledge. So I think it's a bigger structural issue. What do we, no, I'm just like raising it, I'm sorry, because I'm thinking aloud. How do we deal with this dilemma? I mean, aside from diagnosing it, what do we do? Do we not do research about refugees? Do we do, what are the accountability measures? How do we make sure that people are more held accountable? How do we hold accountable other people who are not part of necessarily the Palestinian community of activists and so on?
Thank you, Rabah. Yes, we'll take all the questions, okay? Yeah. Can we hear?
It's just a small comment about Rami's presentation. May also be a kind of answer for about the question. Just what you have said has been the case since the 50s. It was always the same situation. The relation between state and university never was good, never was calm. Nasser, after 1956, expelled all French and British academics who were not involved in the war, but they were expelled. Then after 1967, all academics who denied the war and what happened and the defeat were arrested. Then during the Sadat period, after 1979, all those who signed the petition against the peace agreement were arrested again and went to jails. And then after, in 1981, again, everyone at the university, students and academics were arrested. And Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid, and I mean, all the time academics are being arrested, and the university never stopped struggling. And that's what we are doing, I mean, struggling. Xenophobia also started. I mean, this idea that the regime managed to systematically turn everyone to hate the others and to suspect others. This also happened from 50s, the xenophobia and hating foreigners and so on. But never, the university never stopped struggling, and that we are doing all the time. That's why I want to focus on academic freedom. I mean, university always produced leaders to struggle for freedom. So we cannot say that we just stop speaking about academic freedoms and we say freedom is just burst for the society. I would like to focus on academic freedom as a way to achieve the freedom for society, because academia is the place where we can really produce leaders for the society. Okay, thank you.
I thought I saw a hand here, but then it disappeared. Is there a hand? Yeah, tafadhal. Yeah. Okay. No, there's still, I know, but there was before you, there was a hand over there, so, yeah.
Thank you all. So I had one question. You know, I'm live tweeting this for the Asfari Institute, and then as I was about to do things, I stopped. And I'm interested in kind of seeing, and I had these issues too come up when I'm just doing any type of activism and someone who's aspiring to be a scholar. How do you navigate the space of being a scholar and being critical of the state and expressing this type of dissent and protecting your own bodies? Especially, Rami, you're talking about research being considered espionage in Masr. So just how do you reconcile these issues?
I guess I have sort of a question and sort of a pose, actually. One of the things that I've noticed, we've talked quite a bit about gender equity, and we will in many institutions. But I think it's important to realize that women in all of these societies experience their gender differently because they have additional frames that affect their life. And I tend to hear lots of commentary about gender equity without recognizing those additional frames. even though we sort of recognize them. And that includes ethnicity, that includes race, that includes socioeconomic, that includes education, and that includes religion. And so I wanted to make sure that that was on the table, because I haven't heard anything about that here so far. With regards to the ethics of conducting research in the Palestinian camps, this is one instance where I think the whole idea of academia and academic procedures and policies actually can be quite powerful, because of course in the US system and in the EU system we have the Institutional Review Board, and these types of studies would not, no matter how activistic you might be, you could not do them under an institutional umbrella without having the facility and your discussion and your experimental design examined, because you would be working with a population of people who would be vulnerable. And that grew out of a combination of many different historical events in many different countries, and was promulgated not only in the US but in the EU. And so I'd like to see if there's a way that you can address those topics. And then finally, in terms of a technical question, there must be other types of techniques that you can do that could study the group of interest without necessarily impacting them in the way that you are. And so I'm wondering if you could perhaps think about that. And then my one other comment from my own experience is that sometimes doing research in states where, even in Lebanon, what you find out contradicts what the state wants to focus on can result in some blowback from institutionals, not necessarily the institution of the university, but the institution like the government, as Ali discussed. And so I'm wondering if there's a way in which we can think about those types of frameworks as a way of going forward for a future conference.
My question is for Romy. Oh, sorry. So you said, I totally understand the idea of not separating academic freedom from the freedom in the country, but I was wondering, by academic freedom, do you mean professors and students? Because that might be just a little bit different, especially when you come to look at, as you said, the generational difference in terms of young researchers or students, and the generational gap, especially when you look at the revolution, the January 25th revolution. We can argue that one of the main reasons that sparked the revolution was the students in universities and young researchers, or even older generations, but maybe not as much as younger researchers and students. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentations. They were really moving. I have a question for Perla, and I wonder if you have perceived any an increased sense of disquiet with researchers in the camps, and or if you can trace it kind of over time at all, because it seems that this is something we've been, I at least, I don't know if it's my own issue, but I've noticed it more and more visible that there has been a rising complaint, and I wonder if that is because people feel that the research was done, they're like, okay, these are our conditions, what's the deal, like get something done for us, or if it's related to a sudden influx of people going, how Palestine has become more and more acceptable in Western academia in some ways, not in others, of course. It can be still, you can still be targeted, of course, but there are more people studying it at least, or if it's been shifts specifically about camp studies, and just if you have any sense of, in response to any of those questions. Thank you.
Thank you for excellent papers. And also, I wanted to ask a question to Rami. I really appreciate also this idea of us not being able to separate out the issues that we confront in academia, in the university, with broader society. In many ways, the repression and the injustices faced in the university are a sort of microcosm of what's happening in broader society in Egypt. That's a perfect example of that. But also, I'd like to maybe somewhat provocatively sort of think through this issue of academics and espionage outside of the Egyptian case. And the reason I'm saying this, and also I think maybe connecting it up to Perla's paper, is this question of accountability of academia. And it's kind of not fair in your context. I know it's not something you cover, and you're coming at it from a very different perspective and a different context, which I really appreciate. But I know I was thinking about it because in the Tunisian context, I remember I had a colleague who told me soon after the revolution that he had gone as part of one of these big EU-funded projects to do something on labor activism in Tunisia, and in particular outside of sort of wildcat strikes and looking at things that were happening outside of the institution of the main trade union. And someone asked him at one point, "Are you a spy?" And he said, he sort of stopped and he sat back and he thought, you know, when he, really asking, what are you going to do with this information? And he thought, well, maybe I am a spy. I'm not really sure what this information is going to be, you know, who at the end of the day is going to use this information, and what way might it be useful for people who, you know, would be spying. And I think that is an important question for academics to ask, maybe not only what is the purpose of our research, which might all be well-intentioned, as you said, Perla, but in what ways can it be used in ways also that are outside of our control? And I really like the concept that you raised about academic entrepreneurs. So academics may benefit, but is that really what the aim is of this, of social justice in academia? So I guess it's more of a comment really than a question. And also I just wanted to say there's an excellent paper by a colleague and friend who was here earlier, Anahid Al-Hardan, on decolonizing epistemologies in the study of Palestinian refugees. And it raises also really important questions about how we decolonize our epistemologies, and not just in terms of our theoretical framework. So yeah, thank you for excellent presentations.
It wasn't really a question, just a couple of thoughts. And I think in terms of what Rami was saying, and the question that Rabab is asking, what can be done, I think this is where, in large part, until, and I agree with Rami, until you connect up what you're doing in the university with the general struggle for freedom in the country, etc., that is a process. But that's where also international solidarity comes in, where the solidarity networks come in, the statements that come out in support of, the efforts at Jawaharlal Nehru University, for example, and really raising the cost to states of doing what they're doing, on the one thought. The other thought was, back to Susan's comment on the IRB, the review board, that can actually have a counterproductive effect. Because, for example, you go to someone that you really, please, before I talk to you, you have to read this and sign it, so that, and I think a lot of, that can create a distance. Initially, I'm sitting here being a refugee subject, and I have to sign something right away before I even ask the first question. That's one issue. Other issues, I'm sorry. Well, I'm just using an example. The process of applying and the whole institutional process, oftentimes, it creates a block in front of an honest research that you're really trying to do. And yes, I think what Perla is saying is absolutely correct in terms of your relationship. But I think in spite of IRB institutional processes and whatever, it is what the individual researcher does, and it's the kind of trust that that individual researcher can build that may help. It may not be the answer, but it may help. And it's, the approach and the process is much more important than the structure of it. Thank you.
So what to do? So first, I know I'm depressing, and I guess it is depressing, but I'm not against research. Nor am I saying that actually researchers should stop kind of being interested in the camps. Not at all. Actually, there's a lot of, I think, important research that still needs to be done. What I am saying is that we need to look at how we're doing it, and just having good intentions and the best of approaches may not always just be enough. And that actually I just wanted to highlight also that kind of Palestinian refugee studies are missing, at least I feel, kind of discussion on ethics. And I think, as I said, it's because we think that we are activists, and so that kind of removes the need for that. And I'm just trying to say that it doesn't. And that we can gain a lot by looking at other debates in like anthropology, oral history, and feminist studies, and other disciplines to kind of think through a little bit how we work. And the idea of a microphone that Palestinian refugees kind of sees researchers as a microphone at Julie Petit's time, I think that has changed. I think that it partially answers the question of kind of the moment of like, why is this kind of now this unhappiness with researcher, is that no change has been seen, right? So kind of this microphone effect isn't necessarily working. And I move to just continue on the question. And I think it's also linked to the fact that a lot of the researchers tend to be researching the same topics. So kind of refugees are kind of tired of answering the same questions on over and over again. Very kind of trendy topics are, identity and return. And often kind of also refugees feel that researchers lack basic knowledge. So they come and they're just asking questions that are just so obvious that they just feel like, they should not be spending their time answering those questions. In terms of the institutional, the IRB, I did go through an IRB, we all have to, and from my experience, they tend to center around informed consent, right? They just want to make sure that the research, when you're talking to people, you're getting their consent. They go through, kind of you have to have the people sign a form. Then you argue, there's no way I can get people in Nahr al-Bared to sign a form. They're under, a military siege, and they say, okay. And that's kind of the extent of it. So I don't know how much that can kind of help in that respect.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying, but it's centered around informed consent, which would not kind of solve what I was talking about. I think that was it in terms of kind of my questions.
Did you answer Max's question? Yeah.
That's quiet? Yeah.
So on this issue of what do we do, and why is it any different? I don't think it's different. I said the opposite, that it's not different. I'm saying that this is a continuation. Actually, if you look at the material that's available on, the post-52 republics' position on art, they do not believe in art for art's sake. If you look at their position on the academy, they do not believe in knowledge for knowledge's sake. They never have, and they never will. So I'm not, I don't think, so for Rahab, I completely agree with you, that nothing has changed in that sense. What do we do is actually what people are doing now, which is that after these most recent, catastrophic events, even people at AUC, which is this golden cage of, privilege and, whatever, have realized that they cannot struggle in isolation, that they cannot talk about academic freedom. In fact, there's a whole lot of toing and froing about, why are we talking about academic freedom when since 2013, tens of thousands of people have been thrown into jail, journalists are thrown into jail, artists are thrown into jail. Why should we be talking about academic freedom? Surely all our freedoms are related to each other. And this is where I fundamentally disagree with Rahab. I do not think that it is productive now to talk about academic freedom because talking about academic freedom assumes what you said, which is that the academy has produced the leaders of society. I don't agree with you that the academy. I think that the academy in Egypt is a syndicated society. We have, syndicates for musicians, syndicates for artists, syndicates for writers, and that kind of syndication is about a hierarchy in society. And what the discourse on academic freedom within that context does is say, our freedom is important because we will bring freedom to the rest of society. And I think that historically, there is no evidence for that whatsoever. And in fact, that the academia and literati, I mean, when I was just sketching this out now, if I took AUC as an example, is academic freedom a problem for all people at AUC? Absolutely not. It is a problem for a minority of faculty and a minority of the student body. And for the rest of the faculty, they couldn't care less about academic freedom because it either doesn't affect their work or because they are part of the establishment in one way or another. And so, they believe that, yes, we must be repressive right now in order for stability and so on and so forth. So I don't actually believe that the academy has produced the people who will free Egypt, who will provide people, with the ability to think, about their lives in more progressive ways. I think that's a fallacy, to be perfectly honest with you. But it reflects the way in which we're encouraged to think about the academy as privilege. So I would like to do away with that completely. So outreach, stopping tweeting. Well, I think, if we stop tweeting and if we stop writing and if we stop having the courage of our conviction, and I say this, of course, with a huge bucket of salt and a big gulp in my throat, then we might as well just stay at home. There's no point in me coming here and saying this if really, I'm so worried about my personal safety, then I just shouldn't say it. So I think there's a point at which speaking out becomes productive. And actually in the story of Egypt in the last 2 years, the darkest period of fear, where people are really, really afraid to say anything, I think is passing. And I think it's passing because of how authoritarian it is. And this brings me actually just again back to Rihab and to Rabab, which is that the difference is this, that in the last few years, what we have, in my opinion, are relations of subordination. So, being an academic, being a journalist, being a dissident or whatever, being a young person, these are positions of subordination within the hierarchy of the society, right? But now, what we have are relations of oppression, physical oppression, legal oppression, like it is being used now, at a scale which is very corporeal, it's very real, right? And that is always an indication of how threatening those voices are. And so if we silence those voices, then you're not engaging in trying to push it over the edge, right? So that people reactivate, so that people start to think about solidarity beyond their own constituency. So I think people have to speak out, even if it's dangerous. And then I'm not sure I understood your question exactly, but I also, again, don't subscribe to the view that what created the revolution in 2011 were the intellectuals and the students. I don't think that that's the case at all. I think that people played a part, but some people will trace it back to 2008, to the riots in Mahalla. Some people will trace it back to the demonstrations that have been taking place since 2005 by workers across the country. There are whole loads of ways of reading how and why this happened and who were the critical actors. But I don't assume, as lots of people like to assume, that there are, and this is the thing about Egypt, you kick an Egyptian and they'll tell you, oh, it's because they're not educated. Oh, it's because of the ignorance within society. Oh, we need muthaqafin, and we need... To be perfectly honest with you, I think that is, khalas, that should... It's not true. Quite simply, it is unsubstantiated. It's an unsubstantiated claim which reflects that the ways that society is presented to itself and the way that power and hierarchy is a very real thing in that society. So I think it's just not true. On espionage, I would say to you that we have to reject this, forcefully. We have to, this idea that the person who has connections to the outside world, who is interested in particular questions, who has a particular type of politics, is a spy, is not something that is just there. It is something that is produced. And so in this chapter, I've been working on, the kind of the infrastructure of moral panic. How does a moral panic become produced? Of course, Rehab is absolutely right. From the earliest times in the Republican era, the spy, al-Gasus, al-Mundas, al-whatever, these are things that have all been produced. If you look at how a Westerner is depicted in your average Egyptian film, they all have cigars, they all have, cowboy hats. These are things that are produced. These are things that are disseminated within society. And these societies have been the subject of tight restrictions on what kind of meanings are available to people. So for me, instead of saying, oh, maybe I am a spy, no, I am not a spy. I come to this with love, with curiosity, with with a desire to speak truth to power, however cheesy that sounds. I do. That's why I don't think for a second you go to Tunis to work there because you're a spy. That's ridiculous. Spies are spies. We are not spies. We are characterized. This is the work of representation. We are characterized as spies in order to delegitimize us. And those characterizations are extremely powerful and pervasive in our societies. But we shouldn't succumb to them by any means. We need to identify the structures and the processes through which this becomes so pervasive, as opposed to second-guessing ourselves and saying, oh, maybe I am a spy. If you think, if we think that we're spy, khalas, let's shut up shop. Same thing. Let's just shut up shop and go home and do something else. I am not a spy. So it's a trope. It's not a reality, right? There are spies, but they are, that's what they are. We are not spies. I think I answered everybody's. Yes? All right.
I'm more depressed than I was. But just to give you just an idea of why the monitor, it's not, it's within Birzeit, but we thought that this is an intensive exercise of exposing patriarchy and exploitation and central governance and all these, the extension of the real society within the institution, and link it to trade unions and student movement, because we don't think that we can change anything within an institution or within a society without, the real tools for transformation. But I think it was an important exercise for us as academic activists who are linked to the women's movement, that even Birzeit University, the liberal space, and the best educators still are patriarchal, are still, all the decisions are made on partisan politics, very sectarian, very even Hamule, extended family affiliation. And it was really blasting for us, really, because we never thought that, that was the situation. And I think that was the positive side of it, that we have been able to understand what are the tools for change, because that's what you need. We know that we have patriarchy and we have all that. Even the unions, because in my experience as a president of the union for the first time in Palestine, it was a big challenge for me, because they said, oh, how can you manage a union like that, the biggest union, a teachers' syndicate, when you don't have experience, for instance, as if all men trade unionists have experience. How can you do that? But we know very well that the 2 years that we were there with another 3 female faculty, that we were able to link all issues together, not just the, tuition raise or salary. It was the structural adjustment, neoliberal paradigm linked to gender inequality, injustice, especially for, when you look at the data that we have, where 1% of women who constitute 35% of the faculty are only at a full professor rank, and only 1.8 are associates. And the rest are, of course, assistant and lecturers and instructors, which means that they are, most of women are outside the decision-making process. So gender tools that we are promoting don't really, focus on the academic standards. We don't want to, play with that. But at the same time, a quota system for managerial positions is important sometimes. But that's not the real issue, really. It was a real research for us, for the Institute of Women's Studies, where we can define more how the elite is still, so far away from, being liberated from the very traditional conservative ideas. And what are the ways to change it? And also we know historically that whatever we do in Birzeit is mainstreamed eventually as a process, because we have always been the vanguard. So I think, it's not an important research. I just have, because, Satyanay told me, just talk about the gender audit. I don't feel that the institutional analysis is also important within this political transition, which, when I hear, Rami's Egypt situation, I feel that, what are we doing, of course. But our challenges are different. We are able to confront the occupation and resist every day, and we see this happening. But at the same time, we also see that the importance of democratizing the society and starting with these tools or institutions that are important in the Palestinian political history. And for us, education is a political practice. So I think that was the issue. And that's all.
Thank you so much to all three of you. I just want to, and to the great questions and discussion, I just wanted to say that some of the questions that the three papers raised seem very basic, and they seem like they have answers from other practices. There's IRB, there's this kind of theory, the answer may be in anthropology or in feminist theory or etc. But I think they are vital questions. They have to be rethought in the context of today and in these particular locations. And that I think the answers that may have been useful 20 years ago to some of these same questions are no longer useful. The reflexivity, one of the, I think, points of this panel was reflexivity of our own position as academics within institutions and the role of that institution within society and the intersections. There's some of you have heard me say this. There's an article that I like a lot about the sociology of the university, not of higher education, of the university, which describes the university as a hub, among other things. It's a hub where different sectors of society intersect. And so anything that's happening in the university is a reflection and an extension of what's happening in society. And so in that way, I both agree and disagree with Rami in that focusing on the university or academic practices or academic freedom or research or gender equity within the university may seem artificial, but I think if you're doing it in a way that's not separating this space from the rest of society, then it becomes actually very indicative and very useful. And a lens, just one lens among many. And so I hope this conversation can continue, and thank you to Asfari for inviting us, and thank you to all of you for staying so long. Thank you.
Thank you all. While you're applauding, I want to extend a very particular thanks to the videographer and the translation team, because they have stayed 40 minutes beyond their schedule, so we appreciate your time. And since we are feeling a little bit down, I just want to share a little bit of good news. Some of you may have heard about the protest that's ongoing as we speak. And according to one official news report, there are 1,000 people in the street. According to another news report, there are 10,000 people in the street. So let's aim for the high number and take that on with some optimism, and look forward to seeing everybody here fresh and early and caffeinated by 9:15 a.m., please. Thank you.